only started getting, really kind of digging into the problem of NGOs. For a number of years, I've kind of looked at it and I've seen a worry, because what's going on is that less and less we're relying on our own self-organization, our own movements. More and more, our movements are becoming subsumed into a kind of a not-for-profit model. And so I hope that, we can, collectively come together, look at these issues and see, what is it we can do? How can we get the movement out of this kind of trap that it seems to have been caught into? So, first off, we want to talk about, what is an NGO? It is pretty self-descriptive. It's any non-governmental organization. It's also not a private business. And typically, when we're talking about NGOs, we're talking about not-for-profits. So, a big corporation like Ford isn't a government organization, but it's very much a profitable organization. When we think of not-for-profits, we usually kind of think of the small little organizations that we create. For example, some not so small, but like Greenpeace, Workforce One, such things. But a hospital is a not-for-profit, it's an NGO. Churches are NGOs. Universities are NGOs. Think tanks, NGOs. And foundations, including
moving and watching.
Okay. Including, and these are, some of these are pretty big business. Right now, the number of NGOs operating internationally throughout the world is estimated, there's no real handle on all this, to be about 40,000, just in an international situation. In Russia, there are almost 300,000 NGOs. India leads the world. It has over 3 million. And according to the World Bank, which is itself an NGO, it is now estimated that over 15% of total overseas development aid is channeled through NGOs. So we're not talking a small part of the economy. We're not talking about a small little sector. This is huge. This is a very large part of really the capitalist order. Now, because this is such a large, there's such a broad amount of stuff that we could be talking about. I could literally talk. We could have a whole university course just on this subject, and that's well beyond what we're capable of doing today. So I want to try and narrow the scope just to talk about community-based organizations, to talk about kind of our social movement NGOs, with one exception, and that's we'll talk about foundations as well, because it's the big elephant in the room is money. We need money to do everything that we need to do. Who's got the money? Well, the foundation's got the money. That's where we go get our money, and that's really the heart of the problem. So I want to kind of start with a quote from a comrade from Canada, member of the First Nations. It said, "The condition of revolutionary work today is historically rooted within the development of the world system in its current coordinates of neoliberalism and U.S. empire. And with the collapse of revolutionary movements in this country, alongside the collapse of actually existing socialism, the not-for-profit or non-profit industrial complex is a global feature, and it is, despite its name, part of the political apparatuses of the state in stripping away with one hand to give half back with the other. Capitalism with a human face. The NGO is now the predominant organizational form that pervades in the movement today." As I said before, that one big elephant in the room is money. And where we get our money is typically either from state grants or from foundational grants. Now, foundations were started, as a way for capitalists to pass on their wealth to their children without it being taxed. Currently, the rate of taxation for inheritance is about 35%, so 35% of any dollar would have gone to the state for us to use on whatever programs. And we'll leave aside for the moment that in the hands of the state it would probably be used against us anyway. But it would be available for uses in other ways. Historically, that taxation rate for inheritance has been much higher, 55% as of 10 years ago. One of the first foundations was set up by Nelson Rockefeller. Took his enormous wealth, put it into a foundation, and then set his children up to run it. So they get to pay themselves out of this. They get taxed on the income they draw from it, but the actual wealth itself, rather than losing most of it to the state and whatever semi-democratic control might be exercised over it, even though in the interest of capitalism, that doesn't happen. They get to keep all that money. And as I said, who sits on these boards? Well, it's the children of the capitalists themselves who set them up. Also, people who rise up through various means become capitalists themselves. So if you look, a lot of these people, they all sit on the same boards. When you look at some of the larger foundations, it'll be the same set of people, or the same people from the set of families. Bill Gates, who we'll come back to later, got his fortune because his mother sat on the foundation with, when she was a bank president, sat on the board, foundation with the head of IBM. And so that's how he ended up becoming one of the wealthiest men in the world, because even though he wasn't already, he wasn't a poor person by any stretch of the imagination, but the capitalists more and more are using these as a way, these foundations as a way of shielding their wealth, perpetuating their wealth, and kind of connecting to each other. There are over 67,000 foundations in the United States today. And we're not talking about not-for-profits, we're just talking about foundations themselves. Of the top 100 foundations in the United States, they control $200 billion in wealth. In terms of the data that I started collecting, in about 1975, there was about $30 billion in the wealth of most. For all of the foundations combined, about $30 billion. In that period, accounting for inflation, that total has now come up to $141 billion in 1975 dollars. In actual current dollars, it's, for 2008, was about $468 billion in the control of these foundations. This is not a small amount of money, but they took a little bit of a hit with the recession. So even though all of us are unemployed, they lost about 1/5 of their wealth. So, early on, they realized that they could start using this wealth not merely just to hold on, the foundations not merely to hold on to their wealth, but in order to hold on to the whole system as a whole. So, at the very same time that Nelson Rockefeller was using the governor of Colorado to send in the National Guard to shoot down the Ludlow strikers in Ludlow, Colorado, his foundation was going out there and providing charity work to those same people whose union he was crushing. Now, if they had a union and they were able to negotiate for a contract, they wouldn't need charity work. And that's kind of one of the big aspects of this, is that they use these foundations to stop structural change, and then, with the other hand, give back a little bit of charity. So more than 50 years ago, and this was actually written in the 1960s, the Morgan firm decided to infiltrate left-wing political movements in the United States. This was relatively easy to do since these groups were starved for funds and eager for a voice to reach the people.